Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Chris Novak. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. Hopefully many of you have seen it throughout the years. So I'll kind of walk you through some of the key findings that we've pulled out of this year's report. And at the end, also happy to take questions that any of you may have about the data, about the insights, or even just if there's interesting things you're seeing or ideas for future reports as well. Just for background, for anyone who's not familiar, we've been producing the report now for 17 years, which is hard to believe. In fact, it was the first of its time that really dug into how breaches were happening, why they happened, who they happened to, and most importantly, the reason why we put the report together in the first place was to be able to give people information and insights to help them prevent being the next data breach victim, or at the very least, help them figure out how to drive their security program, their priorities, and things along those lines. So I'll walk you through some of what we see there, maybe just some high-level details. The report this year represents breaches across 94 countries. And for anyone who's interested in kind of how we get to this point, we try to be really clear when we put together the DBIR each year that we don't say this is exactly how every breach has ever happened or this is exactly how it would look like for you. The idea here is we amass a lot of data on various incidents and breaches that happen all around the world through a combination of the work that my team does. I manage a consulting team at Verizon, separate from our internal security team, who is responsible for going out and helping organizations that may have suffered from some kind of incident or breach, figure out what happened, and then ultimately help them on a path to recovery. But then also in addition to that, there's nearly 100 other contributing partners that we work with, everyone from the US Secret Service and the FBI to, we have all sorts of ISACs and certs from around the world as well, even some other security consultancies and incident response providers that also share their data with us as well. So the idea here is to build the best possible cross-sectional view of what the landscape looks like in order to draw these insights out. And if you've read the report, and I should mention this year's report, we say unveiling because it just came out like less than a week ago. So it came out last Wednesday. So probably many of you may not even had an opportunity to read it. It is a lengthy report. This year it clocks in at 100 pages. So if any of you have a long flight back after RSA, maybe you can give it a read on the plane. But that's the genesis of it. That's where we get the data. It is all anonymized and de-identified so that we can really just get to the salient points of what's happening and how, and then really kind of drive home what it is that we can learn from it. We've always kind of had this notion of both incidents and breaches, and you see it again here. Over 30,000 incidents and over 10,000 breaches in this year's report. And if we go back over the entire anthology of the DBIR, it's well in excess of 1 million now. And the difference there, for anyone who's not familiar, the incidents are essentially an alert or an alarm goes off. You need to investigate what has happened, but you maybe don't necessarily know that any data has been lost or accessed in an unauthorized fashion. That typically is what we would classify as an incident. And the reason we call that out, you might say, well, why don't we just care about breaches? Because probably for many of you, incidents have real consequences as well. For example, things like denial of service attacks. There may be no data lost, but it may cause you a really bad day. And so there's other forms of that, as we'll see as well. The breaches are the events where, after having conducted some form of incident response and forensic examination, we've actually confirmed not only has there been an incident, but there's been some data leakage or data loss event that typically requires notification or disclosure, for example. And so that's how we break that out. Some kind of initial kind of highlights and headlines from this year's report. One of the first things that I'll call out is the exploitation of vulnerabilities as a pathway into organizations increased 180% year over year. And we'll get into a little bit more as to kind of why and what that means. And then 68% of breaches involve the human element. And the key takeaway I want to also note here is that this is non-malicious human element. So this is not the inside job that folks may be thinking about. This is the accidental, inadvertent kind of errors and issues that we might sometimes face from a human element perspective that ultimately leads to a breach. The other one that I also want to call out there is 15% involve third parties. And some may feel like that number is low. Some may not see that at all in your own data, your own incidents, your own landscape. But what's interesting is that has actually increased substantially over the course of the last year as well. In fact, that went up almost 70% year on year. And then the last one that I wanted to call out, you see there 31% of all breaches in the past 10 years involve the use of stolen credentials. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment as well. And then obviously you see there's a lot of things that continue to plague us as it relates to social engineering, which ties back to what I mentioned earlier around the human element and the role that it plays. And then also in terms of some of the costs. Now these numbers may appear to some people to be low. You're looking at tens of thousands of dollars, and yet we hear headlines about breaches that are millions or in some cases even billions of dollars. But you also have to remember that when we look at the massive data set that we have, there's also a lot of smaller events that are in there as well that can also have a skewing effect into the overall data set. So what I'm kind of presenting to you here is that global big picture. Some of you in the room may be associated with more small to medium-sized businesses, and the events and incidents that you see are probably going to skew more in that direction. For example, when we see things like ransomware and business email compromises and other forms of extortion, for a small business that tends to skew small because that's all they can pay. Threat actor asking a small business for $20 million, they're not going to get anything out of that small business. Large enterprises, government agencies, they tend to obviously skew bigger. And in many of these cases, the threat actors, they do a fair bit of due diligence to try to figure out who it is they ultimately got into in order to figure out what their capacity or capability to pay a particular ransom or an extortion demand might be. So now, when we look at the ways in which the threat actors are typically getting into organizations, the top three you see there on the left, the first one is credentials, which I think is interesting because a lot of times when I talk to people about this, their response is, really, we're still talking about credentials? Everyone's got two-factor, right? Everybody here, you all have two-factor on everything, right? Probably not. And that's the issue. There's a couple of problems we see. One is, it's not as ubiquitous as we might seem to think it is. If you're really plugged into the cybersecurity community, sometimes I think we have a bit of a bias. We see something so often, we assume it's the norm. We assume it's like that everywhere. But in reality, when we see things break, when we see breaches happen, that's usually where we find out when something wasn't being done or wasn't as expected, because that's the pathway the threat actor took to get into the environment. And still in a lot of these cases, we see organizations that are using single-factor authentication, or there's other attacks that may be getting around the MFA through some form of, say, social engineering. Obviously, we all know that nothing is foolproof, but the issue here is still that we see a lot of single-factor. I'll give you a perfect example of an incident that my team worked on where an organization was breached. We talked to them about multi-factor just so we can understand how the threat actor managed to seemingly get in on the first try. We said, look, they either had to get the password or they had to get someone on the inside to collude with them. They said, oh, no, not possible. We've got two-factor everywhere. I'm like, okay. We start exploring it. Turns out, probably not surprising to many folks in the room, they had two-factor in key places. They had two-factor missing in a lot of other places. The other challenge that we also sometimes see is organizations will look at the manners in which they do multi-factor authentication, and they will apply it. And I don't necessarily fault organizations for looking at it through this lens, but they will apply it to what they consider to be high-risk areas. They'll say, look, anything high-risk, a high-risk application, applications that have access to very sensitive data, we're going to require multi-factor there. These other areas that are lower risk, we don't care about the data or the applications behind them. We're not going to worry about multi-factor. It's expensive and it's difficult and it's friction. And then I say, well, let's pull out the network diagram. So show me where the segmentation is between this low-risk environment and this high-risk environment. Maybe not surprisingly, it's not there. And so the challenge we'll also see is that threat actors will get in through seemingly low-risk parts of the environment and then they'll pivot and they'll move laterally within the organization in order to get to the higher risk parts of the environment. And so when you're going back and you're talking to your teams and you're talking to your executives and they're asking, why do we care so much about this piece of the environment over here that doesn't matter to anybody? If, in some cases, even the issue or the response I'll get is the information in these systems is already public information today. So if someone gets access to it, they could have found it by Googling for it. But the fact still remains that if someone can get into that environment through using credentials, they now typically have authenticated access to other parts of the environment that maybe from the outside world they wouldn't have been able to gain access to. Or there may be vulnerabilities that are exposed to them that they could take advantage of once they have authenticated access to the environment. Social engineering continues to be alive and well. Obviously, you see phishing there on the list. This is also another component of how we might see the credentials are ultimately getting compromised and used in a lot of these attacks. And I think it's interesting, too, when you look at this, those top two, I think, kind of almost go a bit hand in hand, because obviously sometimes the phishing is going to be trying to get you to install a piece of malware. Sometimes it's trying to get you to just give up your credentials. But in many of these cases, that would not be successful. We wouldn't see the level of phishing attacks that we see today if we didn't also see a lot of organizations out there that are still using single factor, right? Think about it. If most everything was multi-factor, the phishing attacks would drop dramatically because they wouldn't necessarily be as useful. And then the exploitation of vulnerabilities. This is one where I mentioned on the previous slide, we saw a dramatic increase in the amount of these. And part of this also is the amount of vulnerabilities that we just saw kind of hit the landscape over the course of the last year, and the ready ability for threat actors to exploit that with proof of concept code that they can quickly move into something that they can scale rapidly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but it goes into and speaks to the heart of what we see around the timeline that it takes to mitigate this. One thing I'll also mention too is around phishing. For anybody who's interested in terms of the different mediums that may be available that the threat actor leverages, the large majority of all the phishing attacks that we see are still coming in through email. So people may ask about SMS, ask about WhatsApp, Messenger, not to say that those are not also pathways in as well, but still the large majority of them are coming in through and people are falling victim to it via email. Now, here, this is one of the first times that we really got into this. This is our survival probability chart, which I think is a little bit, a little gloomy. But what we really try to highlight here is if you look at vulnerabilities as they're disclosed and they're made available, and organizations can get out there and start patching those vulnerabilities. The challenge we see here, and we took a couple of different points on the graph, but the one that I'll call out is the one at 55 days. You can obviously use a number of them. But at 55 days, organizations typically only have about half of the critical vulnerabilities patched at 55 days. Now, compare and contrast that with the time it typically takes of what we've seen over the course of the last year, a threat actor exploiting those vulnerabilities. 5 days. So if we're only getting half of them patched in 55 days, that leaves a giant span of time. I mean, nearly 2 months of time for threat actors to get out there. The other issue that we've also seen is that threat actors have gotten much better at attacking at scale. It used to be that we'd see something like one of these vulnerabilities come out, people would put it into their patch program, they'd say, look, we're gonna get to this in 30 days, 60 days, 180 days, depending on what their patch program looked like. And generally speaking, for a lot of organizations, they might have been perfectly fine, because in many cases, we'd see the threat actors would take months to be able to build exploit code, or their ability to actually go out and attack the volume of targets was limited in terms of their capacity to do so. So it was a numbers game, right? You're playing a numbers game. And you see the title of the slide, Survival of the Fittest, Survival of the Fastest. And I was actually going to edit it again and say maybe it's really Survival of the Smartest. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to title that. But the point here is partially about speed. How do we get ahead of the threat actors in terms of the time it takes us to patch these vulnerabilities? Part of that also goes back to how it is that we're approaching it. Because a lot of times when me and my team have conversations with organizations out there about their patch and vulnerability management programs, one of the challenges we often hear is, we've got limited resources, we've got a limited budget, we've got limited technology. I would love to be able to apply every patch the moment that it comes out. I just can't do it. It's not possible. Or there's other constraints within the organization. I need to get approval from this group and that group and that group and that group, and that just takes 55 days. And what we're starting to see, and also I'd say kind of nudge the industry to look at, is more around risk quantification of these vulnerabilities. Because the challenge we see a lot of organizations still face today is that they kind of still look at a lot of this stuff as it's all the same. A vulnerability is become known, it's given some kind of rating, and then based on that rating, it enters into your patch program, and based on that, it determines how fast you move on it. For some of you in the room, that may be how it works for you. Others in the room may have moved more into a risk-based approach, where now they're looking at it and say, look, forget about the score and the rating that others have assigned it. I believe in my environment, that rating is different. That risk is different, rather. That risk is higher or that risk is lower, and it could be for a number of reasons. For example, you may have an application in your environment that has got a critical vulnerability, but it may be only accessible internally, it's behind 3 firewalls, and it's really difficult for anyone to actually get to, let alone exploit. So maybe for you, that's actually much lower on your list of priorities to go out and patch. Versus something else where you say, well, you know what, maybe it's not rated or ranked as high of a vulnerability, but for us, it's directly internet facing, and millions of people can touch it. And so maybe for us, that is something we actually prioritize and patch faster because we believe the potential exposure and impact, if that's exploited, is worse for us. And so that's why I said, it's maybe not necessarily the fittest or the fastest, maybe it's the smartest about putting some level of risk quantification into the picture. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is around some of the data-driven metrics. I already touched on the 68% of breaches involve the human element, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as I continue. But also I wanted to touch on the landscape as it relates to things like ransomware and extortion. And then as it relates to errors, we continue to see the element, as I mentioned earlier, the human element, the role of the inadvertent or accidental user. For a lot of organizations, that's their biggest risk. In fact, sometimes I would use this slide and say that the biggest risk is inside our organization already, and it's not necessarily a bad malicious threat actor out there in some far-off land. It may just be a user internally that just simply made a mistake. And then the last piece that I mentioned earlier was around some of the third-party elements. What we see a lot of organizations starting to lean more into now is something that we often refer to as supply chain or third-party elimination, to really get a view into what that third-party or supply chain looks like. Because what we find is that a lot of times when we start looking at breaches, they may not necessarily always start within your own organization. It may very well be that you have a third party that you work with. In fact, this very same example happened not that long ago, maybe just a couple of weeks ago, where an organization had commented to us, oh, we heard about this breach that this particular organization had. Thank God that doesn't affect us. Then about 2 weeks later, they called. Remember that conversation we had 2 weeks ago? Turns out they used that vendor. And it turns out they were impacted by that breach. And that was the entry point into their organization. And so as we look at how businesses are operating today, more and more of them are becoming interconnected with a broader supply chain, third-party, and vendor ecosystem. And historically, what we would see, and in fact, this also was a recent conversation that I had with a CISO who said, I'm not worried about all of these particular third parties and all of this other stuff. If there's an event, I'll be able to go to my C-suite, I'll be able to go to my board. At that point, they'll give me the budget for the stuff that I need to do. But at that point, it's too late. You're already in the hot seat, you're already on the back foot, you're already trying to now figure out how do we get out of this bad spot. And in the case of a third party, the other challenge may be, we often find that if your breach is the result of a third party, it takes you longer to even find out about it. I don't know how many people in the room have had this happen to them or their organization where you've had to deal with a third party coming to you and say that they've been breached. I'm gonna bet for most of you, you're gonna say they did not come to you nearly fast enough. If they came to you within a day, kudos to you. You are probably in like the fraction of the 1%. But most often what we find is it's days, weeks, or in some cases even months. In some cases, I've even heard organizations found out about some of these events from another colleague or peer of theirs at another organization, and not necessarily from that third party or supplier themselves. So there's a lot of challenges there, and so that's why we're also looking at ways and encouraging organizations to look at that supply chain and third party illumination and say, don't just look at it through the vehicle of your contracts and say, well, our contracts say our vendors and suppliers must do all these things, but have you considered actually doing spot checks of some of them yourself to see whether or not they're living up to those obligations? In fact, a lot of times what we'll see organizations do is they will risk rank their vendors and say, look, based on how they are plugged into my business, I will give them a risk ranking. And then if they are on the highest risk ranking, maybe once a year, every couple of years, depending on your organization and how you view the risk, you give them a visit. And what is also very interesting is how often you'll find that the vendors and the third parties you use will suddenly become a lot more honest when they know that you might actually execute that right and perform some of those reviews. Now, this is an interesting review of the data. The chart on the left, I think, it's a good news and a bad news story. What it shows us is phishing emails reported, and one line you see there, I don't know if you want to call it blue or green line, indicates that the person fell victim to it. They suffered the phishing attack, they clicked on it, they gave up their credentials, but they contacted the IT security folks and said, look, I'm sorry, I did this, I just want you to know. And then the red line is people who, they saw the message come in, they reported it to security, but they didn't click on it. And I'd say it's a good news, bad news story from the perspective of, it's a bad news story because the numbers are still very low. I mean, the chart tops out at 20%, and we're not there yet. It's a good news story in that both of the lines are moving in the right direction. Both of the lines have more than doubled year over year, or I'm sorry, not year over year, but over the course of this time period. And so I think we're heading in the right direction, and I think the other important piece here is when you look at that blue-green line of clicked, this is people self-reporting they made a mistake. This tells me that the stigma of all of this is maybe starting to go away a little bit, and or organizations are really trying to reach out and encourage people. Because the challenge sometimes we'll hear from organizations when we go out there and do these breach investigations, it's not uncommon, incredibly not uncommon, that we'll figure out who patient zero was. What was the first laptop or desktop or whatnot that clicked the link, gave up the credentials, that led to the massive breach. We'll talk to the individual and say, can you tell us what you saw, what happened? Do you know anything about anything around this date? Did you see anything? Do you remember seeing this email? And you kind of see them kind of, their head down. Yep, I remember that email. I remember clicking on it. I remember putting in my credentials, and then I remember deleting it. Like, do you remember reporting it? They don't remember that. And so what we see is that there's still that element where organizations, maybe sometimes the pressure or the fear on individuals, and so as a result, they don't report it. Now also, in some people's defense, they may not even realize they were phished. And so in some cases, they may not have reported it because they didn't even realize what had happened. But the fact that these are on a positive glide slope, I think is at least a very good story of maybe where we're going. The other piece is the dot charts on the right. And this is what I call the Gone in 60 Seconds. I don't know if anyone's seen that movie. And what this highlights is the speed in which these attacks typically take place. It typically only takes about 20 or so seconds for that message to come in, hit someone's inbox, and for them to open it. And then another 20 plus or minus a few seconds to click through, put in the credentials, and submit it. Again, give or take. So you're less than 1 minute from the point in which that message hits the inbox, that if the individual has not recognized what they're up against, they've probably already been victimized. And in some cases, they're playing catch up. Now, I mentioned ransomware and extortion earlier. This is actually one of the first times we really broke out the data in this way. And it's interesting because last year when we looked at ransomware, we actually saw a slight decline. And we said, all right, that's interesting, because you saw that hockey stick going up. What's going on? We started dissecting the data a little bit differently this year, and now you see a new line emerge. You see extortion. And it's separate from ransomware. Ransomware being the historical events that we're all very familiar with. Someone gets a piece of malware onto your system, they lock up the system, they lock up the data, they demand X amount of Bitcoin to get it back or get it unlocked, and that's your ransomware. We're seeing that on a decline for a number of reasons. One is the mechanisms that we're all deploying are now starting to work. The resiliency elements that we're implementing are having an impact. Organizations are pushing back and not necessarily being forced into a position of having to pay the ransom. I mean, if you think about it and you look at these threat actors, they're almost exclusively motivated by financial gain. If they're not getting paid, they're not doing this. And so as we start to see the ransomware events decline, that's really part of that story, is we're starting to see our own cyber resiliency, cyber defense, and improvements actually taking shape and pushing them back. The problem is they're moving into other areas because they don't want to give that up. That's one of their revenue streams. And so what they've done is they've moved into other areas like targeting things like DDoS for ransom. I'm not sure if any of you have experienced that. Obviously, as an ISP, we see all sorts of DDoS activity, and I've got another slide on that I'll share with you in a moment. But it's interesting to see where some of these threat actors will now say, you know what? Fine, you got backups, you got all this stuff, you're not going to pay my ransomware ransom, then I'm going to hit with a denial of service attack. I'm going to take down this site or that site. Typically, they will look to try to hit organizations at a time that is maybe most significant to them. Maybe they've got some kind of public release or something along those lines, and as a result, that is an optimum time for a threat actor to hit them and impact their business. And they feel like that's a greater chance that the victim will ultimately pay whatever the extortion demand is. The other twist that we also see on this is related to things like targeting executives. We've seen an increase in situations where information about the executives is either obtained through things like data brokers or the deep and dark web, or even from other assets within the organization. And that information is used to try to extort the company and say, look, we're going to take this information that is either very personal or very embarrassing, or we're going to threaten these individuals unless you pay. And so there's a whole element of executive identity protection and things like that that have actually popped up in the cyber realm to kind of maybe match what we've seen in the realm of physical security. Now we look at the breach patterns. We've actually done this now for a number of years where we've kind of mapped out what those patterns look like over time. And it's kind of, I don't know, almost like a little kid picture with a lot of crayons and markers. You see the up and down, the ebbs and flows of these attacks. One of the things that's interesting here, and I encourage when you have the chance, read the full report, because this is obviously the macro view. There's a lot of industry views and geographic views where sometimes you'll see these shapes kind of take a different, or create a different picture. But you'll see, for example, the ebb and flow of social engineering over the course of the years. You'll see the fact that some of them have remained relatively high over the course of the last couple of years around system intrusion. A lot of this being tied back to what I mentioned earlier around the stolen credentials, the ability for them to be easily used, targeting of things like web applications, and leveraging those stolen credentials or social engineering in those activities. Perfect segue into social engineering. The top method that we see prevailing is maybe not what most people would think. You probably are thinking it's going to be phishing. Pretexting is really the top one that we see. And this is often tied to business email compromises, where they trick an individual into believing that they're legitimate and get them to typically execute an instruction. And oftentimes it's, we've seen the stories, it's a wire transfer or something like that. We've probably all heard the big one. It was the $25 million one in Hong Kong, caused a lot of stir. And what's interesting is if you look at the dot chart on the right, this highlights essentially when these events happen and an individual goes and typically they'll reach out to maybe someone like us, law enforcement, or a combination of the above. Say they need help. We did this, we wired this money, what can we do? And it's interesting when you look at the numbers on that dot chart, you'll see they're only about, give or take, about 20% or so, they had nothing recovered. So whatever went out the door, it was gone. And then if you look at it, you see about 50% had about almost 80% of the assets, we say frozen, but essentially that means recovered. And so think of this as, you've heard the situation, whether it's a wire transfer or even in some cases it's cryptocurrency, which a lot of people will sometimes challenge me on, of how the heck do you possibly get these things back? In a lot of cases, there's ways where those assets can be frozen, they can be stopped midstream, they can be touched or reached in various jurisdictions, and those funds can be clawed back based on what you see here. And so sometimes when I talk with people, they'll say, well, that's great. What do I have to worry about? We'll just reach out to law enforcement, the FBI, Secret Service, whomever. We'll just have them get our money back. That is not a strategy, trust me. So obviously, there are some number of individuals and organizations that fall into that category of they get nothing back. So obviously, nobody wants to go to their C-suite and board and say, well, we took a shot and we lost. And then obviously, the other category is still only 50% have managed to get back almost 80% of those assets. And I know sometimes the numbers can be a little bit confusing for folks, but the key there is, while we have been successful in recovering funds, it is not a guarantee. Organizations need to be looking at how they're obviously building resiliency into their processes so they never end up in that position in the first place. Also, the other thing I would highlight is, this is like when you call 911 and they say, every second matters. The same thing in these cases. The more time that passes, the harder it is, if you're going to potentially be successful in recovering the funds, the more time that passes, the harder it is to do that. As you would probably imagine, what these threat actors do, once the money moves, they try to keep the money moving. Whatever it is, whether it's actual currency or cryptocurrency, they try to keep it moving until they can eventually launder it or mix it or something else such that it becomes nearly unrecoverable. So I mentioned denial of service. Obviously, as an ISP, we see a lot of this. We feel a lot of it. As you can imagine, any organization that gets hit with a denial of service that lives on our network, we essentially have to carry the traffic. And so we are kind of, I guess you might say, kind of a third-party victim of some of these attacks. And so we do a lot of analytics on this. And what's interesting is when I showed you the breach and incident patterns, and if you look at the report, you'll see this as well. One of the things I always find fascinating is how many organizations don't necessarily invest in or consider a DDoS or a DOS mitigation capability or service, because it's one of the most easily preventable types of incidents that we see, but yet we see a lot of organizations, they don't think to put something in place, or they don't, I don't know if I want to say plan to put something in place, until they're in the midst of an incident and they're getting overcome, typically at a very poor time, and now they're trying to figure out, how do they stop it? How do they make the pain stop? And so just highlighting that these are very much alive and well. We continue to see the throughput of these attacks continuing to increase with more and more things like IoT coming online every single day. We also see the amount of devices and endpoints out there that could be harnessed in order to be able to conduct one of these attacks continues to just increase. And obviously, with every passing one of those, there's the potential for more vulnerabilities to be exploited and just increase that surface area further. And I'm sure you couldn't come to RSA and not hear someone talk about generative AI, so I'll mention generative AI, because everybody wants to know, what does the landscape for this look like in cyber? Now, there's a lot of different lenses that we can view this through. The lens that we took here, and I'll tell you, there was a lot of back and forth with the team on how to frame this up in this year's DBIR. If you look in the past, we never talked about AI or generative AI. And this year, as we were looking at the data, we said, oh, looks like we're not going to talk about it again. And we're like, wait a minute, we can't not talk about it, because everyone's going to say, how the heck could you not be talking about AI when everyone's talking about AI? So we had this interesting back and forth, and we decided, you know what, okay, we're going to talk about AI, but we're going to tell it like it is, what the data actually shows us. And what that chart represents there is that the amount of mentions of generative AI and kind of commonplace use, and you can see that it's skyrocketing. But then you can see the amount of mentions of generative AI as it relates to threat actors actually using it. and it's bobbing across the line there close to zero. And what we wanted to highlight here, because there's always somebody who will pull me aside and say, well, but I heard that someone used ChatGPT to write a phishing email. I heard someone used this to create a piece of malware. I've heard those, I've seen those. They are real. The point of this is not to say that that can't happen or won't happen. And I honestly think that as we lean more into the future, we'll see more of that. But right now, what the data shows us is in the grand scheme of the incidents and breaches that are actually occurring, we're not seeing things like AI and generative AI being used in any grand scale by the threat actors. In reality, what we're finding, and I don't know if this is a good news story or a bad news story, you can argue with me later. Ultimately, what we believe this tells us is the threat actors are having, I don't know if you want to say great success, with the methods that they're currently using. So they haven't really needed to lean into this all that much. And the way I kind of describe this to folks who say, but AI can do this so much better, it can do it so much faster. Maybe. But if you've got a tactic that is working, and you're making millions and millions of dollars, and no one is seemingly stopping you or slowing you down, put yourself in the threat actor's shoes. Does it make any sense for you to spend more time and get you or yourself up to speed? I mean, maybe roll the clock back. I don't know how many people here have used an AI tool and how many haven't, but if you can think back to the first time you used it, you had to figure out how. You had to figure out how you asked the question. And then you got answers back and you're like, oh, that was stupid. That didn't work out the way I wanted it to. Or it was a very uninteresting or useless response. And you had to figure it all out, right? We now have entire programs out there, educational programs on prompt engineering. And that is a job for people. So if you think about the level of effort that goes into making this a very useful and efficient and scalable tool, it's not trivial. And so what we're finding is that the threat actors are leveraging what they know and what has been successful, and they're continuing on that path. Now, like I said, that's not to say that we won't see this change in the future. I do believe that we will see them start to lean into it. But I think one of the interesting takeaways was, as I look back on this, is that I think it's actually one of the few areas that when we look at cybersecurity, we as the defense actually have an advantage. Because most of the significant advancements and investments that have been made in things like generative AI have, I'll say, it's been intended for positive use. People may have misused it, but organizations are out there trying to put guardrails on it. In fact, I grabbed this screenshot here of ChatGPT asking it essentially how often it's being used or about malicious use. And basically it responds back and says, I'm trying to prevent that from happening, essentially. And everybody out there who has got something like this that is trying to figure out a way to monetize and make available to the masses their AI or generative AI solutions are trying to do so in a way that they can put guardrails around it such that it's used largely for positive use and less so for negative use. And I think the challenge that the threat actors face there is they need to try to figure out how they overcome the ability or the fact that a lot of the tools that we have now or will have in the future will have this kind of capability behind it to give us an advantage. And at that point, I think they will start to lean in. But I think we're probably looking at months to years before or to watch as that ultimately matures. In terms of kind of where we go from here, obviously, I want to encourage everybody to read the full DBIR. I got the link there. I don't have physical copies. People always ask if I have physical copies. I don't have them with me. I told you earlier, clocked in at 100 pages. So if I came with physical copies, they'd be taller than me. But if you want to talk about physical copies, grab me afterwards. But definitely read the full report because there's a lot more context in there. And like I said, there's a lot of different ways in which we slice the data. I also want you to encourage you, if you have questions that the DBIR doesn't answer or you feel like we missed, we really do appreciate you reaching out. We have a DBIR@Verizon email address that you can contact. The other challenge we face every year as we put the report together, we have more data than we could possibly publish. The report could easily be probably 1,000 pages long if we cut all the data and said, this is what we see. We have to pick what we think is probably most interesting and actionable to the readers. That means that there's data that we have that's not published. If you've got questions, like I said, reach out. We may be able to actually provide you with charts and data that answer a specific question that you have. The other thing also that I'll add is the feedback and the questions that we receive feed into how we augment the report going forward. So when you see new things in the report, one of that might be driven by new trends we see, but part of it also might be, hey, we've gotten a lot of questions about it. Rather than leaving that on the cutting room floor, it makes it into the report. The other thing I'd also encourage you to take a look at, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Verus framework. That's actually the structure, the bones of how we actually create the DBIR each year. We actually created the Verus framework when we created the very first DBIR 17 years ago. And we made that all open source. So if you go to verusframework.org, you can actually download all sorts of information. There's links to our GitHub repository. You can download some of the sample data to play with. You can actually create, and now I think we've got probably over 10,000 organizations today that are leveraging it, that they create their own internal version of the DBIR using their own data. And to be clear, you can do all of that without us or anyone else having access to it. This is all something you can do on your own if you're interested or you've got a data science team that wants to play around with it. I also encourage you to refresh how you look at that incident data within your own organization, how you manage things like cyber risk, how you're aligning your strategy and looking at things like risk quantification. This has been a growing area, especially as it relates to some of the changes we've seen around things like the SEC regulations. There's a lot of organizations that are looking at that and saying, we need to maybe do more than what we've been previously doing around risk quantification to figure out, hey, if we have an event, if we have an incident, and it touches this application or system. In fact, I've seen some really amazing organizations where they've tied their risk quantification into their asset inventory. So now when MoveIt or Log4j or something else like that goes bump in the night, they can go right into their system and say, okay, this is what I have a concern about, and it can tell them these are all the systems, applications, and data that can potentially be impacted by that. And based on the risk that we are concerned about those, this is what we believe that ties back to in terms of dollar potential loss. And so for organizations, as they now start to face the reality of having to figure out, the SEC regulations, is this event material? They need to start having more data and better data in order to be able to ascertain that. Reviewing your approach to vulnerability and patch prioritization. And then the last one there is just cybersecurity culture. I think this one is often overlooked, often minimized. There's a lot of talk that's happened, and even some of the things you've probably seen and heard here at RSA, maybe not so overtly, but I was actually having a conversation with someone in the back of the room before the session about how the notion of the importance of the cybersecurity culture is starting to change some of the big organizations out there, household names that you and me all know. So really encouraging that be something that is top down and that the organization really seriously presses into. And with that, that's the end of my prepared slides. Happy to take questions if folks have them. I've been asked to remind you to go to the microphone in the middle if you've got a question. And then also, we've got the Verizon booth at North Booth 5770. Feel free to stop by if we don't have time to talk after the session today. I'm more than happy to chat there or offline. Thank you very much.
Quick question about the credentials. You said there was like 30% or something that's still involved, credentials. You said a lot of it didn't have 2FA on. Was there anything around SIM swapping in there or other indications of just MFA failing?
Yeah, so when we look at the data, we see very little in the overarching data set that would indicate it's the result of SIM swapping. When we've looked back on that over the course of the last years and got some data from some of the, I'd say more of the telecom consortiums, the SIM swapping activity seems to be on a decline. The landscape there seems to be improving around the security of that. And ultimately that being tied back to credentials, what we ultimately find is the SIM, that might tie back to the phone, but not necessarily the way in which we're seeing the credentials being harvested. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about your role in Verizon as far as education of the end users and the organizations? I mean, you touch a whole lot of organizations, probably more than any of us. So what have you guys been doing in terms of educating, putting those types of issues up front and talking about them?
Yep. So end user education, I can't stress enough how important that is. We take that obviously very seriously at Verizon. Given the fact that we publish the DBIR, we really have to, what do they say, drink your own champagne? So we really try to lean in on that. So we've got what I would say is a very mature security awareness and education program everybody has to go through. It is constantly refreshed and changed. Everyone has to be also tested on it, attest that they've gone through it, all of the usual things that I'm sure a lot of organizations are touching on. But also we feed in data from things like the DBIR into our own educational material. So we'll reference the things that we see. We try to also bring in things like case study examples. So not just these are the good behaviors to do, these are the bad behaviors, but also try to make it real for individuals as to what happens and what do these events look like, how do they fit into the big picture? Because the challenge we often see is that cybersecurity education for people who are not cybersecurity individuals sometimes is difficult for folks like us to appreciate. We think that all of our end users understand it like we do. And so we tell them, don't do this or always do that. But we oftentimes forget to tell them why. To all of us, the why is understood because we deal with it all the time. So in their mind, what they'll do, and I see this at times when we investigate breaches at other organizations, they'll say, oh yeah, I saw the training, but I assumed that applied this way or that way, or I didn't see it through this context, so I thought what I was doing was safe. And so explaining the why that goes along with the behaviors you want them to do or not do is also very important. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, on a few of the slides you had either 20 or 28% of the breaches were owing to human error. And is there another level of detail, and categorically how does that shake out?
In terms of the human element?
Yeah, well, there was phishing and social engineering,
sure.
but then there was just error, human error.
Yes.
So, yeah, so what does that look like?
Absolutely. So I'm glad you asked that. So the human error is not just the social engineering piece. That's obviously a big piece of it that we see, but there's also the element of, if you look in the report, you'll see things like misdelivery, where a user, and we see this all the time, where someone will have a breach and they'll think that the organization got hacked, and in reality it might just be they had to notify or disclose to an attorney general that they emailed sensitive data to the wrong email address, or they made something available to the wrong vendor. Maybe nothing malicious actually happened, but the fact that the data wasn't in the custody of the people it was supposed to be, or it was outside the bounds of their controls, meant that it might have been a notifiable event. And so it would then be classified for many cases as a breach. So we see things like misdelivery. The other one that I'll also mention is around configuration errors. This is usually just the human error of, I went to go apply a new firewall rule, and instead of such and such deny, I accidentally said accept, or I redirected traffic to the wrong network interface, something that should have never been able to reach my internal network. Oops, it was routable. And so those are other areas where we'll see human errors feed in. Yeah. Any other questions? I think maybe we got another minute.
So is there any section in the report that talks about something like the top 5 controls that if you implement will prevent maybe 80% of the attacks? If not, is that something that you're considering to add in the upcoming reports? And if there is any way that organizations can do this analysis?
Yep, absolutely. Great question. So if you look in the report, you'll actually see that we do that. And we actually have tried to slice it by industry. So depending on, and obviously not every industry conceivable is in there. We look at it through maybe about a dozen or so macro views. So depending on, if you're in retail, if you're in hospitality, if you're in financial services, there is a carved out version of that data that both shows you what are the biggest risks for your particular industry, because it may be different. And this is something I have a lot of conversations with people about. We all know that healthcare is different than financial services, is different than manufacturing, is different than defense. And so the types of attacks that they might see based on different motivations by threat actors may differ, which might translate into different types of exploits and targeting, which ultimately then goes to your point of what are the best controls in terms of prioritization. So you'll find that in those carved out sections. If there's an industry, I don't know what industry you're in, but if it's not there, reach out and we'll look to see if we can carve that data out for you. I think that's probably, I'm getting the high sign. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to grab me at the back. Thank you again.